Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about a new book by a very well-known and established author, Edmund White, with A Previous Life, which is just about to come out on the 25th of January, at least in the UK. And this book was such a wild ride that I kind of just wanted to talk about it a bit. Edmund White, you know, very well-known queer writer, and particularly he talks a lot in this book about that, actually, and I'll kind of come to that in a little bit. But this is a story where he's sort of reflecting on love and relationships, and particularly the kind of complicated nature of them and how that can feel very, very bizarre. I will go into some spoilers, and I'll announce before I get to that. But I just wanted to sort of talk very briefly about it first. I really enjoyed it, but it is also kind of worth saying that this book is very, let's say, explicit in terms of content. It talks a lot about sex and sexuality, and something I really love about this is that Edmund White is not afraid to just give you every single detail. I mean, the book, fairly early into the book, there is a sort of lengthy description of characters discussing girth, and like this is, I feel like this is peak Edmund White. It's wonderfully unapologetic as well. It sort of just goes for it. And it was really funny actually seeing some of the comments just before I read it, because somebody on Goodreads said something along the lines of Edmund White is that person where you feel like you know too much about their sex life despite having never met them. And I'm like, yeah, actually, yeah, especially with this book. So I kind of will add that a cautionary note to it here. But essentially, for the most part, this book is concerned with two central characters who are talking, sort of sharing stories amongst each other about their relationships. And this is where it does get interesting, because one of the people in the book has had a relationship with Edmund White. And Edmund White is mentioned several times by name as a character in his own book. And where it gets even a little bit more meta on top of that is at one point the novel A Previous Life that you are reading gets referenced within the book, in a really quite fun and clever way, where there's basically someone who is reporting on, who's a sort of scholar, almost a future scholar on Edmund White, talking about the book. And this is also where I think Edmund White is kind of at his most sort of almost mischievous in this book. Because he has characters talk about Edmund White and say things that almost feel like an inner monologue of Edmund White himself, of his own fears and insecurities. So characters saying things along the lines of, well, it's good to see he's still writing at this age. The Saints from Texas and A Previous Life. It's good to see he's writing strong books later into his life. And I kind of just have this image of Edmund White typing that, being like, ha ha ha, like, here we go. I'm talking a bit about myself and my own novel here. But this is also where I'm about to go into some spoiler territory, because there are some bits that I think, yeah. So feel free to stop there if you want. What I will say just before you go is just that I think this is a really fun book and well worth checking out. I also totally see how, for some people, the kind of graphic nature of this and the kind of thematic nature of it might put people off. But I think it's still a fun book and really exciting to see, such a sort of legendary queer writer still writing books of such good quality, even if he does say so himself. With that, I'm about to head into some spoiler territory. So, in the relationship between this man and Edmund White, we learn a lot. When I say a lot, I mean a lot about Edmund White. Well, the character Edmund White, who may be different from the author. Let's give that might be a thing in this book, that we shouldn't necessarily assume that the two are the same. But this kind of really detailed, almost exhumation of an old relationship, of kind of looking back and trying to work out where people went wrong and what things were said and what the reasons and motivations were. And part of it does feel like Edmund White himself is almost trying to work out what went wrong. But that's also to assume that this was actually a real relationship. I personally don't know. It might well have been, it might not have been. And that kind of makes it more fun for me, actually, that Edmund White is kind of potentially playing with us as readers, because if it is a real relationship, we're learning a lot about everything that went down. If we're not, Edmund, if it wasn't a real relationship, Edmund White has created this thing and kind of used himself as a vehicle within his own relationship, which I thought was really within his own story, and set the story in the future looking back at a previous life. And so the title starts to feel like a bit of a joke on itself, right? That a previous life, the novel, and a previous life being referenced, but also a previous life is a previous novel, in, you know, all that kind of stuff. Anyway. And so yeah, I thought this was really good and really fun, and the kind of queerness of it all is really interesting, because you've got this kind of character who is Ruggiero, I believe. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing the Italian name well, but there we go. But he is basically meant to be this sort of beautiful, beautiful man, you know, very, very toned and muscular, very endowed, very, you know, lots of things going in his favor. And sort of, we're meant to kind of assume that, we're meant to believe basically that men and women alike fall in love with him all the time. And what's really interesting about how that's then played out is we almost get this idea of understanding the limits of sexuality and of, if your identity is bound up with your attractiveness and with your sexuality, what happens when, for example, one of those things is sort of taken away from you in some way. So the character Ruggiero, when he kind of gets older, if people are still looking for him, or there's a whole thing about how younger men looking for older men might not necessarily, you know, as a sort of sugar daddy thing, might not necessarily want somebody who's really confident and self-assured, as Ruggiero might be in his older age. What they might want instead is somebody who's a little bit more passive, who can maybe be wooed a bit more easily, and he doesn't fit that. But at the same time, we've got Edmund White, at least the character, maybe not the author, talking about his own aging process and sort of saying things like, you know, at one point he goes on there's a website, like for a sort of dating website for sort of older men called something like Silver Daddies. I think it was Silver Daddies, something like that. And he realizes that the age bracket on that is 60 to 80, and he's 81, and he's like, am I too old for Silver Daddies? What does that mean for me? And so actually this book deals with aging in quite an interesting and clever way that is not immediately obvious in the book, because so much of it is bound up with the idea of sexuality and your kind of social capital almost being your looks and what that means. And obviously someone like Edmund White is almost having the last laugh, like, because even if he's lost that social capital, he's Edmund White. He's a sort of an established author. He is sort of referred to sort of several times in terms of his sort of wisdom and his kind of cleverness and all those sorts of things. But we also see Edmund White really almost excoriating himself with the you know, sort of saying, well, of course he would see me this way, or describing himself himself through other characters. So Ruggiero talking about him really unflatteringly, you know, and kind of dismissively by his looks, as sort of almost like I think like a sack of meat at one point, and various other things. And so we're kind of almost meant to be disgusted by him. And so it feels like, in some ways, Edmund White is sort of exercising those demons, but at the same time is kind of having the last laugh. And so I think that's what ultimately sort of won me over with this book, was that even in its kind of moments where it sort of seems the most absurd, Edmund White still is very much in control, it seems. And we don't fully know if we're being presented Edmund White, the author, or Edmund White, the author as a character in a book who may or may not be the real thing. Anyway, I thought it was really interesting, and it reminded me a lot of J.M. Coetzee's book Summertime, which is a sort of auto-fiction memoir, but written as a kind of fiction, sort of, well, I think he calls it something like a fictionalized autobiography or something like that. But in Summertime, so the first two of that trilogy, which are brilliant as well, are very much written from the first, like very much following J.M. Coetzee. Summertime is written after his death, as sort of characters looking back and talking about what they knew about him. And it reminded me a lot of that in a really clever way, of just sort of Edmund White in a previous life, looking back and kind of imagining a sort of a life after he has died, where people are, you know, the last few people are maybe remembering him and sort of writing academic articles about him, before he sort of fades into this sort of obscurity. But ultimately he is longer lasting than this man who is sort of not sort of memorialized or immortalized in the same way that someone like Edmund White would be. Anyway, I hope if you do pick it up that it interests you. It's a bit much as a book, but I also thought it did some really clever things. I'm keen to talk to a few more people about it. Anyway, I've been Bob the Bookerer. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.